Now that we know how to use try and catch to look for exceptions in our code, we're going to go back over to Android Studio and create a new application which will download content from the web. Now this is a really powerful thing to be able to do because it's the beginnings of connecting our apps to online services such as Google Maps, Twitter, Facebook, any publicly available service that we can work into our apps to add power and great features beyond what we could just code ourselves. So it's a really cool thing to be able to do, and it will show us a number of new ways to work with Android apps as well. By the end of this lecture, you'll know a lot more about threads and how to use a different application thread to have two threads going at once. All right, so let's do it. We'll call it downloading web content, and we'll use all the usual settings, blank activity, and here we are. So we're going to ignore the layout completely, and all of our code here is going to be in the mainActivity.java file. All right, so just to be really clear what we're trying to do here, let's look, for example, at a great website. If you haven't worked with websites before, you might not know that behind every website is some HTML code, and you can get that by right-clicking or control-clicking in your browser and going to something like View Page Source, and then that will show you the actual HTML code which is behind that web page. So there's a lot of code that makes up this particular web page, and that's what we're going to try and download, and we're just going to put it in the console for the moment. So all our aim is to get this content and put it in the console. That's not particularly useful, but if we use it in conjunction with what are known as APIs, or application programming interfaces, which allow you to download useful information and then process it and give it to the user in exciting ways, then that is extremely powerful. So it's kind of the first step onto being able to do a whole bunch of exciting things with your apps. All right then. There are quite a few steps to this, I'll warn you in advance, but you are going to learn a lot of stuff about Android as we go. And we're going to start off by creating a new class. So we're going to use public class to create our class. And remember, a class, nothing to be scared of. It's just a collection of methods and variables that we can use in our app. And really, although what we're creating here is a class, it's basically just a method. So to be using it just to run the process of downloading some web content. So I'm going to call it download task. It's a task because we're doing something, and I've used a capital D there because classes normally start the first word with a capital letter, unlike variables. Now, this class is going to be a special class which is going to extend another class called async task. There it is. Now, before I lose you, don't worry about async task. All it is a way of running your code on a different thread to the thread that we're used to. So we run most of our code so far in the onCreate method. This is known as the main thread or the UI thread. Now it's advised by Google, and it's generally a very good idea to run any code which could take a fair bit of time on a different thread to the main thread. Now that's simply for the reason that we don't want to delay the running of the UI thread, because that's the bit that displays the app itself to the user. So really what we're doing here is just creating some code that will be run in the background. That's what async task allows us to do. Now async task takes three variables. The first is usually of a type string. The second I'm going to call void. And the third, again, is usually of a type string. Now, these three do very different things. So this first one is the type of variable that we're going to send to this class to instruct it what to do. So, as you might anticipate, we're going to send it a URL, a particular location, which in this case is going to be this string here. So https www.ecowebhosting.co.uk. So this is the type of data that we want to send to our download task. This middle attribute is the name of the method that we may or may not use to show the progress of this task. So if we were downloading a big file, for example, that we knew was going to take 5 or 10 minutes, we might have a separate method which shows on a progress bar how far along that is. And that's where we would put the name of that particular method. But we're not going to do that here, so we're just going to put void. And finally, this third variable type is the type of variable that's going to be returned by the download task class. And actually, we don't need this. We're going to return the URL content as a string. All right, hopefully that makes sense. If not, feel free to go back and have another listen to that. And also feel free to Google async task and get some more information about it. There's a load of stuff that you can do with it. I'm just giving you the information that you need right now. If you're curious, feel free to pause the video and go and find out more. Now you can see we've got some red underlining there. That's just because we're not using yet a critical method in this task. So I just tapped on the red light bulb and selected implement methods, and that's going to implement the default method that we need, which is this one here. It's actually implemented it outside of our class, so I'm just going to pop it back in. There we go. So now we've lost that error. So now we've got some more weirdness. We've got this do in background protected string and a string ... So don't worry, I'm going to talk you through that. And that is, I think, the last bit of major weirdness in this lecture. So don't panic too much. So this protected keyword here is a bit like public, but it means that this string can be accessed from anywhere in the package, not just this class and not even just this Java file. It can be accessed anywhere in the package. So basically anywhere in your app. And that's because this do in background variable is a built-in part of async task, which is this backup thread that I was talking about, which again can be accessed anywhere in your app. So that's all that protected means. And now we've got this last bit of strangeness, this string ... Now that's known as var args, and it's a relatively new variable type in Java. Now you can more or less think of it as an array. It's very, very similar to an array in that this will contain a bunch of strings that we have sent to this download task. Why don't we just use an array, I hear you ask? Well, mostly because do in background forces us to use var args, but it is reasonably useful. I'll show you how. So now that we've created our download task, obviously it doesn't really do anything yet, but we can call it from our onCreate method as usual. And we do something like this. We'll create a new variable of type download task, and we'll call it task, and it's going to be a new download task. Then we're going to take our task and execute it. And because we said that we wanted to send some strings into it, let's do that. So the string that we wanted to send to our download task was this one. So if we run this, we will in a minute with a couple of slight tweaks, but if we ran this, we would be sending the string www.ecowebhosting.co.uk to the download task. It would be stored as an array called params. Now, as I mentioned, it's not quite an array, it's a var args, but that just works differently because it allows us to do something like this. So let's say I wanted to download two URLs. So ecowebhosting and Stack Overflow.com, for example. So var args differs to an array because this wouldn't quite work if the params variable was an array. I would have to create it as an array like that, which wouldn't work here. So really it's a way of being able to add as many parameters as we like in our call to the task without having to specify at this point how many there are. But other than that, you really can think of var args as just like an array. Again, I don't want to go into that in too much detail now. If you want to learn more about var args, have a quick Google. It's VARARGS, but for now I'm going to focus on this. So before we actually create the code to download the website, let's just see how this all fits together and just run this to display this variable in the logs. So if I want to access this variable here, I would do something like log.i URL and then params 0. There we go. So just like an array, I would take the 0th member of the array of strings that has been sent. And then I did say up here that this was going to return a string. So I'll just return done for now. And then how do we get the value that's returned down here? What we do is we create a string that I'll call result, set it equal to task.execute, and then we add .get on the end. So this then gets the result of this task and puts it in the variable result. Be good to then see the result. So let's just log it. There we go. And you can see we've got another error here. If we just have a look and see what that is. Aha! We need to surround it with try and catch. So this is because we're calling a task within async task. And whenever you do that, you have to use try and catch. And in fact, it's given us two default catches, the interrupted exception and the execution exception. So this is because it's happening on a different thread. So we have to keep track of the fact that it could go wrong. So I'm just going to give that a little bit more space. So you can see we've got those two types of exception there. And we've also got this method that we haven't seen before, print stack trace. So that's a Java method that's just very useful. It prints all the information that we might want about the error that occurred or the exception that occurred. So it's a good way to send an error to your logs. All right, so a lot of new stuff there, but hopefully that mostly makes sense. Let's just run that, and we should then get the URL printed in the console, and then the string that's returned from that class also printed in the console under result there. So what we have so far is really just a kind of default async task setup, which doesn't really do anything interesting, but it does run some code in the background thread. So if ever you need to do that, then this is your kind of structure for setting that up. And here we go. If I just scroll back up there, you can see we've got the two important lines. Difficult to find a little bit inside the rest of everything, but there they are. So there's our URL. HTTPS eco web hosting, and there's our result done. All right, so nothing on the surface of it particularly novel there, but we have done something pretty critical, and that is we've run a task on the background thread within async task. So generally a very powerful thing to do, specifically a very important thing to do if we're going to be doing something that runs for potentially quite a long time, like downloading some content from the web. All right, so now finally we're in a position to write our code to download this web content. Here we go then. We're going to start by creating a string called result, which is going to be where we store the actual HTML content of ecowebhosting.co.uk. Then we're going to create a URL variable called URL, which initially is going to be empty. And a URL is a little bit different to a string, even though it is basically a string. It has to be in the right format to be able to make it a URL, and it needs to have a variable type of URL to allow us to use it as a URL. And finally, while we're creating variables, we need a variable of type HTTP URL connection, and we'll call it URL connection. And initially it's going to be null. So just empty. You can think of HTTP URL connection as being a bit like a browser. So we're kind of opening up a browser here, and we're going to use it to fetch the contents of a URL. That's more or less what's going on. And now we're going to do a couple of things which could result in errors. So we're going to surround this with our try and catch. And I'm just going to have a general exception E as my catch. And then if we do get an exception, I'm going to print the stack trace, which of course just gives the details of the exception. So the first thing that we're going to do, which could possibly result in an error, is we're going to try and convert the string that we've passed to the doInBackground method as a URL. So we're going to take URL and create a new URL, and we're going to do that from the variables that was passed to the doInBackground method. Now this is previously called params, which is a little bit vague, so I'm going to call it URLs. So we know that this is only ever going to contain one URL, but it could possibly contain more. So just to make it clear that this is not quite an array, remember it's var args, but we can think of it as an array, and so I'm going to call it URLs because it could contain many different URLs. But we're obviously only interested in the first one, so we're going to create URLs 0. So this could possibly give us an error or an exception if this was malformed, for example. So if I just sent it like that, then we'd get an exception because that's not a valid URL. But we can rely on our code, so we're very unlikely to get this exception, but we've got it there just in case we do. All right, so now that we've got our URL set up, we're going to set up our URL connection, which is a bit like opening our browser window. And we do this from URL, and then within our URL, we open a connection. Now that doesn't have a type of HTTP URL connection, so we need to cast it as an HTTP URL connection so that it matches up with the type that we created URL connection with up here. So now we've effectively opened a browser window and started to attempt the load of URL. Now we need to actually do that load, and we do that using an input stream. And we normally call our input stream in. Let's add the necessary code for that. And we get that from URL connection dot get input stream. So you can imagine what that is. This is just a stream to hold the input of data as it comes in. We then need to be able to read that data. So we're going to create an input stream reader, which I'm just going to call reader, like that. And that's going to be a new input stream reader, and we're going to create it with our input stream, which is in. So we're kind of building up our system to read the contents of that URL. And we actually do that one character at a time. So we're going to create a variable called data, which is going to be equal to reader.read, which will keep track of the location through the HTML content that we're currently on. So we're going to have a while loop, which will keep on going as long as data is not equal to -1. And that's slightly weird, but what happens is data will count through, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., and just keep on going while it's reading characters through the contents of the URL, and it will keep going, and then once it gets to the end, it will have a value of -1. So that's why we can use this while loop to read our data. Then we're going to create a char, a character, which we'll call current, because it's the current character that's being read from the file. And that's going to be equal to data, but because data is an integer, we want to cast that as a character. So that will essentially get whatever the current character is that's being downloaded from this stream, from the URL. Then, almost finally, we're going to append that to result. Like that. So what we're essentially doing is we're continually reading characters from the input stream reader and adding them to results. So result's going to end up being a big string containing all of the characters of the HTML of that site. Finally, we tell data to move on to the next character. So like that. So this just means data is going to keep on going and looping through all the characters in this stream, so in the contents of the URL, until it gets to the last one, at which point it will have a value of -1 and it will be finished. And believe it or not, we're now there. So what we can do is return result. So that means the result of this is returned back to the original task, and then we can print it out here. So I'll just change the label to have contents of URL. And then I'm going to get rid of this returned done. Actually, that might well cause problems where it is, because, and I'm just going to pop in a return failed to catch this exception. So if we go back here, then we could do a check to see if result equals failed, then do something, show the user that this failed. But we don't need to do that this time because we're just checking the logs anyway. All right, there is one more thing that we need to do before we run our app, and that is we have to request permission to use the user's internet connection, because that's a special privilege that the user may deny us. And we do that over in manifests and then in the Android manifest file. So we haven't really looked in here before, but if you've done any iOS development, this is very similar to the info.plist file. Essentially, it contains a bunch of information about your app, like the name of the app and a few other pieces. And it's also the place where you ask for specific permissions. So if you want to ask for a permission, then you normally do it up here just before the application section there. And we do it like this. So we have uses-permission. And then the name of the permission is android.permission. Let's get that right. Internet. And then we close that tag like that. So you have to obviously get that exactly right. And then this will pop up. If your app ever makes it into Google Play, then this will pop up in Google Play and it will show the user that this app is going to use their internet connection. So generally, it's a good idea to show the user that you have a good reason for using their internet connection rather than just putting that permission in there. All right. So fingers crossed. Let's see what we get. Okay, there we go. You might just be able to make out that here is the full contents of ecowebhosting.co.uk. Fantastic. All right then, so that's it. You may feel that we've had to work harder than you expected to get this result, but we've done a lot of really quite complex stuff there. We've learned about this try and catch setup, and we've learned how to use this quite complicated async task idea to run a task in the background. Fortunately, it's all been well worth it because we're now able to do something really powerful, namely grab content from anywhere on the web. We're now going to take that a step further and see how to download images and display them directly in our apps.